Hi, Year 3. So I'm starting a new 3 o'clock read. I did start doing a 3 o'clock read a while ago, but as I was reading it, I didn't really enjoy it. And I kept reading a little bit further just to see if I enjoyed the story. And I didn't really like it. And I thought, well, if I don't like reading it, then I don't know whether people are going to be enjoying listening to it. So I thought I would leave that. And when I went into school recently, I went back to my bookshelf and I stood there and I thought to myself, what books does my entire class seem to love? Loads of people want to read them, and so much that I had to buy a second set just to keep up with how many people loved these books. If all these people in my class love these books, why don't I just read them to everybody for my 3 o'clock read? So I'm going to be reading you a series of unfortunate events. If you've already read these books, it's still great to listen again, because as I'm reading them, you might hear or notice things or make links between things that you didn't notice before because you were too busy focusing on reading. So listening can help you actually notice more about the story. So I've got the first book. I also have the second book with me, and I can get more depending on how fast we read them. But I'm going to start by reading the first book. Chapter 1. If you are interested in stories with happy endings, you would be better off reading some other book. In this book, not only is there no happy ending, there is no happy beginning and very few happy things in the middle. This is because not very many happy things happened to the lives of the three Baudelaire youngsters. I think Lemony Snicket, the author, is putting that in there. Not to make you not want to read his book, but to make you want to read it. Even though he's telling you you're better off reading another story, I think he's doing that to make you want to read, because you're now wondering, well, what happens to these children? So it's not about not wanting you to read, it's about making you want to read, because I want to keep reading, because the first thing that I thought of was, well, what happens? Violet, Klaus and Sunny Baudelaire were intelligent children, and they were charming and resourceful and had pleasant facial features, but they were extremely unlucky, and most everything that happened to them was rife with misfortune, misery and despair. I'm sorry to tell you this, but that's how the story goes. I'm already gripped. We've only read one page and I'm already completely gripped. What happens to these children? Their misfortune began one day at Briny Beach. The three Baudelaire children lived with their parents in an enormous mansion at the heart of a dirty and busy city, and occasionally their parents gave them permission to take a rickety trolley. The word rickety, you probably know, here means unsteady or likely to collapse. Alone to the seashore, where they would spend the days as a sort of vacation as long as they were home for dinner. This particular morning it was a grey and cloudy day, which didn't bother the Baudelaire youngsters one bit. When it was hot and sunny, Briny Beach was crowded with tourists, and it was impossible to find a good place to lay one's blanket. On grey and cloudy days, the Baudelaires had the beach to themselves to do what they liked. Violet Baudelaire, the eldest, liked to skip rocks. Like most 14-year-olds, she was right-handed, so the rocks skipped further across the murky water when Violet used her right hand than when she used her left. As she skipped rocks, she was looking out on the horizon and thinking about an invention she wanted to build. Anyone who knew Violet well could tell she was thinking hard, because her long hair was tied up in a ribbon to keep it out of her eyes. Violet had a real knack for inventing and building strange devices, so her brain was often filled with images of pulleys, levers and gears, and she never wanted to be distracted by something as trivial as her hair. This morning she was thinking about how to construct a device that could retrieve a rock after you had skipped it into the ocean. Klaus Baudelaire, the middle child and the only boy, liked to examine creatures in tide pools. Klaus was a little older than 12 and wore glasses, which made him look intelligent. He was intelligent. The Baudelaire parents had an enormous library in their mansion, a room filled with thousands of books on nearly every subject. Being only 12, Klaus, of course, had not read all of the books in the Baudelaire library, but he had read a great many of them, and he had retained a lot of the information from his readings. Retained a lot of information means that he'd kept hold of it. He knew how to tell an alligator from a crocodile. He knew who killed Julius Caesar. and he knew much about the tiny, slimy animals found in Briny Beach, which he was examining now. Sunny Baudelaire, the youngest, liked to bite things. She was an infant and very small for her age, scarcely larger than a boot. An infant is a baby. What she lacked in size, however, she made up in size and sharpness with her 4 teeth. Sunny was at an age where one mostly speaks in a series of unintelligible shrieks. Except when she used a few actual words in her vocabulary, like bottle, mummy, and bite, most people had trouble understanding what it was that Sunny was saying. For instance, this morning she was saying "gack" over and over, which probably meant, "Look at the mysterious figure emerging from the fog." I wonder if it really meant that. Maybe because the Baudelaire children seem so intelligent, maybe Sunny's intelligent too, but she just can't say it yet because she's still a baby. Sure enough, in the distance, along the misty shores of Briny Beach, there could be seen a tall figure striding towards the Baudelaire children. Sunny had already been staring and shrieking at the figure for some time when Klaus looked up from the spiny crab he was examining, and saw it too. He reached over and touched Violet's arm, bringing her out of her inventing thoughts. "Look at that," Klaus said, and pointed towards the figure. It was drawing closer, and the children could see a few details. It was about the size of an adult, except its head was tall and rather square. "Who do you think it is?" Violet asked. "I don't know," Klaus said, squinting at it, "but it seems to be moving right towards us." "We're alone on the beach," Violet said, a little nervously. "There's nobody else it could be moving towards." She felt the slender, smooth stone in her left hand, which she had been about to try to skip as far as she could. She had a sudden thought to throw it at the figure, because it seemed so frightening. "It only seems scary," Klaus said, as if reading his sister's thoughts, "because of all the mist." This was true. As the figure reached them, the children saw with relief that it was not anybody frightening at all, but somebody they knew, Mr. Poe. Mr. Poe was a friend of Mr. and Mrs. Baudelaire, whom the children had met many times at dinner parties. One of the things Violet, Klaus and Sunny really liked about their parents was that they didn't send their children away when they had company over, but allowed them to join the adults at the dinner table and participate in the conversation as long as they helped to clear the table. Participate means to join in. The children remembered Mr. Poe because he always had a cold and was constantly excusing himself from the table to have a fit of coughing in the next room. Mr. Poe took off his top hat, which had made his head look large and square in the fog, and stood for a moment, coughing loudly into a white handkerchief. Violet and Klaus moved forward to shake his hand and say "How do you do?" "How do you do?" said Violet. "How do you do?" said Klaus. "Oh, yow!" said Sunny. "Fine, thank you," said Mr. Poe, but he looked very sad. For a few seconds nobody said anything, and the children wondered what Mr. Poe was doing there at Briny Beach, when he should have been at the bank in the city, where he worked. He was not dressed for the beach. "It's a nice day," Violet said finally, making conversation. Sunny made a noise that sounded like an angry bird, and Klaus picked her up and held her. Yes, it is a nice day," Mr. Poe said absently, staring out at the empty beach. "I'm afraid I have some very bad news for you children." The 3 Baudelaire siblings looked at him. Violet, with some embarrassment, felt the stone in her left hand and was glad she had not thrown it at Mr. Poe. "Your parents," Mr. Poe said, "have perished in a terrible fire." The children didn't say anything. "They perished," Mr. Poe said, "in a fire that destroyed the entire house. I'm very, very sorry to tell you this, my dears." Violet took her eyes off Mr. Poe and stared out into the ocean. Mr. Poe had never called the Baudelaire children "my dears" before. She understood the words he was saying, but thought he must be joking, playing a terrible joke on her and her brother and her sister. "Perished," Mr. Poe said, "means killed. We know what the word perished means," Klaus said crossly. He did know what the word perished meant, but he was still having trouble understanding exactly what it was that Mr. Poe had said. It seemed to him that Mr. Poe must have somehow misspoken. The fire department arrived, of course, Mr. Poe said, but they were too late. The entire house was engulfed in fire. It burnt to the ground. Klaus pictured all the books in the library going up in flames. Now he'd never read all of them. It seems to me that Mr. Poe seems a little bit awkward. It seems like he wants to be sympathetic and be careful of the fact that the children have also obviously lost their parents, but doesn't know how to do it in a nice way, because he keeps saying the word perished, which I think is very unkind, and it doesn't really seem to, he doesn't know how to comfort them, so he's just throwing information at them, which obviously isn't what the children need right now. Mr. Poe coughed several times into his handkerchief before continuing. I was sent to retrieve you here and to take you to my home, where you'll stay for some time until we figure things out. I am the executor of your parents' estate. That means I will be handling their enormous fortune and figuring out where you children will go. When Violet comes of age, the fortune will be yours, but the bank will take charge of it until you are old enough. Because we need to remember, the oldest child is only 14. Violet's still only 14. Although said he was the executor, Violet felt like Mr. Poe was the executioner. An executioner is somebody back in like Tudor times who would have chopped off people's heads, like when Henry VIII said chop off their head. So Anne Boleyn, the executioner, would have chopped their heads off. He had simply walked down to the beach to them and changed their lives forever. Come with me, said Mr. Poe. He held out his hand. In order to take it, Violet had to drop the stone he was holding. Klaus took Violet's other hand, and Sonny took Klaus's other hand, and in that manner the 3 Baudelaire children, the Baudelaire orphans, now were led away from the beach and from their previous lives. Okay, that is the end of chapter 1, so I'm going to stop there. I think so much has happened in that chapter, that more than we actually realise. If you think about it, all that's happened so far is the children went to the beach and Mr. Poe came and he told them that their parents had died. But this is the start of so many stories, and it's all starting with their parents dying and now they've become orphans. So that first chapter is the start of an incredible journey that we're going to keep reading. So if you think about it, there's 13 books, and in that first chapter is when the children become orphans. So think about how many things must happen to these children, and we've only just started. I'm feeling very, very sorry for Klaus, Violet and Sonny. It seems like it hasn't really sunk in yet, and they haven't really had any comfort because Mr. Poe doesn't really seem to know how to do that. So I'm going to leave that there, because I think at the start of chapter 2, the story is going to start expanding and we're going to start finding out a little bit more about what's going to happen to them. So I'm looking forward to reading chapter 2.